All right, hi, welcome to Edmonton, welcome to Alberta, welcome to the APT and National Trust Conference that's happening virtually here in Edmonton. I'm Vivian Manasc. I'm principal of Manasc Isaac Architects, and for the last decade or more we've been talking about reimagining existing buildings. This whole idea of what to do with their existing buildings has been a thread that has woven through the work I've been doing for a very long time. I came to Alberta from Montreal in the 1970s. Back in the 70s, Montreal was really at the height of the Save Montreal movement. Phyllis Lambert, who's in that photo, was actively advocating, started to buy historic buildings because they were being threatened, they were being torn down. At the same time, when I came to Alberta, there was a very different culture, right? The culture of preserving historic buildings really wasn't in the mood. In the heart of what was happening in Alberta was really a love of everything new. It was boom time in Alberta in the mid-70s. There were buildings from the 50s and 60s that were already being considered for demolition. And the idea that we could continue to renew ourselves was really, I think, at the heart of the culture here in the province. Of course, in Alberta, history has always been interesting to people, but as you can see, there's Alberta provincial historic sites and museums. There's lots of photographs of historic, Edmonton, Jasper Avenue in the 1930s. People do value and cherish history, but it's very much in terms of a museum or historic park or an artifact or Fort Edmonton, something where you go and you kind of enjoy history in its own little bubble, but the living city isn't integrated into a historical context, but is constantly new. I think that's really very much what struck me when I came here, was this idea that everything old could easily be torn down. In fact, it's funny, I guess if you live any place long enough, you get to see things over and over. On the old building on the slide is the Tagler building, which those of you from Edmonton will remember, but it was standing alive and well when I first came here in the 70s. It was one of the sort of key large-scale commercial office buildings of the time, and there was quite a controversy about whether it should be torn down or not. It was ultimately demolished and replaced by the Bank of Montreal building, which strangely you see on the right side of your slide being demolished yet again. So both of these buildings are now gone, the one that was the historic one and the one that replaced it, and it remains to be seen what's coming next on that site. Right now it's sitting there as a vacant lot in the heart of our city. But this is kind of, I think, really typical of what the Alberta context is this sort of short time frame that people associate with buildings, and really thinking that a building is a commodity that can come and go, can be replaced. And so how do we reframe that thinking? How do we reimagine that thinking? And that's really at the heart of what we want to talk about this afternoon. Another interesting example of buildings that have come and gone, I guess. On your left you see the old Edmonton City Hall, which on this particular image was called Edmonton's New City Hall. It was from the 1950s. Strangely enough, in the 70s, that was actually the subject of my thesis project in architecture school, was how to expand that building and repurpose it without tearing it down. Of course, that's not what happened. What actually happened is it got torn down. The new City Hall, as it were, the new City Hall, is still standing. We'll see for how long. It's very much a building of the late 80s, early 90s, as you can see. And it serves our city well, but we'll see what happens in the long term. We really do have to change that thinking, though, about buildings only having a 30 to 40 year life, and really imagine buildings being able to be renewed over and over. So how do we do that? Strangely enough, even today, just this summer, a historic building, historic school that was perfectly good, makes me cry actually to see buildings like that demolished. I really wish that we could find a way to shift the narrative here from just demolishing things to really finding creative ways to repurpose and reimagine every building. As you can see, Edmonton's a winter city, a city where energy has been almost free for a very long time, but it isn't anymore. Also a city that has a lot of buildings from the 70s because of the boom-bust cycle of the nature of this economy. We have a lot of buildings, not just beautiful historical buildings, but also buildings that are a little less attractive, buildings that are a little bit more commercial, buildings that are a little bit less refined. And so if we're thinking about ways for these buildings to be kept, to be to have their lives continued, it really would be interesting to see what we can do systemically at the whole city level, that and cities like Edmonton across North America, right? This is Calgary, this is Denver, this is so many cities that have a very large 1970s building stock. And of course, this conversation about reimagining existing buildings isn't just a conversation about retaining history, it's also a conversation about climate change. It's a conversation about the embodied carbon that's in these buildings, the amount of carbon that results from demolishing existing buildings, and the amount of carbon that is captured in the structures that could continue to serve us well for many years to come, so that our climate change imperatives and our decarbonization of our built environment can be served by repurposing existing buildings. Of course, this isn't a new conversation to those of you in this room. There's been lots of studies that have spoken to this issue. It's talked about the greenest building in the world being a building that already exists. And we know that to be true, and yet it's a really tricky conversation to inspire others with. We also know that no matter how sustainable we make new buildings, we can, have LEED Platinum certification, we can have 30 to 50% more energy efficiency, but it still takes between 10 and 80 years to recover the carbon that's existing in the embodied energy of that existing building. So I think from just a pure climate change perspective, it's a strong argument to make, and will speak to people who are more concerned about the long-term decarbonization of our communities, and perhaps less concerned about the historical narrative. So just for fun, I thought I'd share with you a way that I've personally chosen to reimagine our relationship with the city, because existing buildings are not just places where we live, work, and play, but they're places where we actually change the conversation. So this penthouse that's sitting on the top of this repurposed office building is where I happen to live. And I thought I'd invite you into my home to share with you the idea that these spaces that are reimagined can be even more beautiful than just a brand new building. It can be more interesting, can be more dynamic, and can really shape the way we think about our cities, right? That relationship that we have with something that's old as opposed to something that's new. Could it be both? Could we have both old and new? So thinking about the old and the new, there was a project a number of years ago that we were hired to design. It's a primary care center in Edmonton, and the health authority had actually acquired a piece of land that was a historic school site. It was the old Cromdale School here in Edmonton. Was one of the few actually buildings that was built in the 1930s, so in the period between the two wars, during a time when very little was being built in Edmonton. The mandate we were originally given was to remove that old school and create a new health center on that site. For a wide range of reasons, not the least of which was we rather liked the old school, we set about to come up with some strategies that could convince the health authority that maybe keeping the old school and integrating it into the new building might actually be a good approach. And so what we looked at was whether some portions of the functional program that was given to us could actually be accommodated in the historic building. And turned out that actually wasn't that hard. I mean, schools are easy buildings to repurpose. They have high floor-to-floor heights. They have large classrooms. And so integrating office spaces, clinical spaces, and so on into that old building was actually quite readily done. Then we created a link or a bridge to the new building. The advantage, of course, to the community was that they got a historic building retained, that the new building is far less imposing on the site than it might otherwise have been had it been that third bigger, and that there's still green space on the site, which I think was super important to the community. You can see people enjoying that outdoor space. So we were able to create a win-win by keeping that existing building, repurposing it, reimagining it by re-insulating it, changing its thermal performance, and adding a new building that integrated well. Interestingly enough, just economically, this was done at a time of escalating construction costs in Alberta, which happens every few years. And at that time, it actually ended up that the portion of the building that was reimagining the existing was the portion that retained its budget most easily, and the rest of the project kept escalating because of construction costs at that particular moment. So economically, it turned out to be actually the least expensive part of the building. Another interesting early Reimagine project that we worked on here in the city was the Service Credit Union acquired a building that had been originally built as a call center. And it was really rather unattractive, it was rather inefficient, it was rather dysfunctional, and it really didn't serve them at all. And so we reskinned the entire building. We reclad it in order to improve its thermal performance, improve its aesthetics, and make it something that a financial institution could be proud of calling its head office. Essentially what we did there was we reclad over the entire building. So you can see in this slide the whole strategy of reskinning, adding layers of insulation, adding new cladding, and we completely replaced all the glazing as well. So all the glazing went from double glazed, heavily tinted, quite dark glazing that was really quite uncomfortable to completely clear quad glazed system that was able to be reinstated into the existing curtain wall frames. So we created a much more efficient thermal envelope and created something that is a much more pleasant interior environment for the occupants. And of course, our financial institutions loved it because not only did it look better, not only did it feel better, was more comfortable for occupants, but it actually saved significant amounts of energy, 70% savings in gas, 42% savings in electricity compared to what the building had been. And that was just by redoing the envelope and, of course, at the same time, modifying the mechanical systems to suit the new envelope. And it's a far more comfortable building and continues to serve the credit union very well. This kind of starts the conversation about not just what to do with beautiful buildings, but actually what to do with less than beautiful buildings and how do we reimagine them. So here's the continuation of that conversation. The building on the left was actually at one point cited in the Edmonton Journal as being the ugliest building in the city. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it certainly wasn't very attractive. It also didn't perform very well thermally, as you can see in that thermal scan. And so it was uncomfortable, it was inefficient, it was poorly constructed, and there was talk about maybe just demolishing it. But of course, in this case, there were actually more than just aesthetic imperatives to reimagining it. There were also commercial imperatives. Our challenge with this one was to think about how to actually reimagine this building while it was fully occupied, because the commercial imperatives were actually less about saving the building or the carbon as much as we cared about those things. It was really about saving the revenue stream for the owner, and that could be accomplished, of course, by keeping the building fully occupied. So what we did was we created a strategy where we very selectively removed the precast cladding, replaced it with very high performance curtain wall, reclad over portions of the precast, but at all times we kept the building fully occupied. So you can see in the slide that we had interior partitions that were there to protect the occupants from the work that was going on outside. And throughout the entire construction phase, that building was fully leased and fully occupied. And so there's the before and after. And so I think what's interesting about this is not just how it turned out, which I think is quite delightful. But I think what's interesting is it reframes the conversation between what's old and what's new, right? And so in a culture that really values newness over old things, a culture that values something being changed out every 30 years, that reskinning strategy, that ability to reimagine and create something that's really dynamically new in the city without destroying what's old, is really the win-win that we're looking for as we talk about reimagine in this context. And the more opportunities there are to create those spaces where we can have both the old and the new all at once, the more likely we are to save existing buildings, both for environmental and historical purposes. Going back to that same building, you can see how the Reimagine strategy not only makes a difference in terms of the larger scale urban context, but also makes a difference in terms of urban design at the street scale. It changes the whole relationship between the building and the street and creates a much more pleasant, walkable, urbane environment, which is really what we need to do in our cities to make our cities come back to life. So often they're not very alive in the downtown. Then there's, of course, other buildings from the 70s, again, office buildings in our city that are being reimagined as residential buildings. A very important conversation, I think, that's happening in cities all across, whether it be New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Edmonton, older office buildings with smaller floor plates that aren't serving contemporary office environments, although who knows, in a post-COVID era, we may be rethinking smaller floor plates again. But these small floor plate buildings do lend themselves actually pretty well to becoming residential buildings, and those kinds of reimagine projects are becoming more and more prevalent in our cities across, and definitely more prevalent here in Alberta, both in Edmonton and in Calgary, as office space needs decline. And we're expecting in the next few years, in light of COVID, in light of more people working from home, that this is going to accelerate and that there's going to be more need for office buildings to be converted to residential purpose. And another small example from here in downtown Edmonton. If you happen to like the back alleys of your cities and you look for little historic buildings that happen to be tucked away, I think this is a little bit of a gem. It's the head office of the Edmonton Community Foundation, and it includes a historic building, a link, and an old building that got reskinned, all sort of tied together as one new office environment for the Community Foundation. So examples like that I'm sure exist in all of your cities, but it's really fun to be able to find those little gems that you can save in a really interesting way to enliven those little back corners or little back alleys of our city. So as I mentioned, our team has been focusing on reimagining existing buildings for quite a while, and we've created a magazine which you're welcome to subscribe to, and that magazine talks about different ideas about reimagining buildings. One's in our own city. The one on the left is a former Remand Center that still sits vacant, so we had done some reimagining around that. The one on the right you've already heard about as the Jasper and 109th. And we continue to publish these magazines about once a year to curate stories and examples and show people what possibilities there might be for their existing buildings, to inspire people to think about how else they might keep an existing building rather than tearing it down. And so just to close, I think this story about reimagining buildings ties into sustainable design, ties into carbon. A residential or a commercial tower could have as much as 2,000 metric tons of carbon embodied just in the concrete alone. So there's a lot of carbon to be saved. There's a lot of energy efficiency to be achieved with reimagining existing buildings. And there's a lot of urban quality to be gained by rethinking how our existing buildings that are a little less than beautiful can be brought back to life and extended for another 50 years, 100 years, or more. So thank you very much, and be happy to hear your questions. I'm looking forward to the question and answer portion of our presentation, and feel free to email me if you have any other questions.